The morning my older brother Marcus stood outside my Denver apartment with tears streaming down his face, I couldn't help but think about the Spanish textbook he'd thrown in our backyard fire pit 6 months earlier. I'd watched through the kitchen window as the pages curled and blackened, my months of careful notes disappearing into ash while he stood there with his arms crossed, satisfied. That was the day he'd pointed at me and declared that if I wanted to keep studying Spanish, I'd have to do it at the all-night coffee shop downtown because our family home was now a foreign language-free zone. The way he said it, like he was a judge passing down a sentence, still makes my chest tight when I remember it. Growing up in our little suburb outside Denver, Marcus had always been the golden child, but not in the traditional sense. While other parents bragged about honor rolls and college acceptances, our parents celebrated Marcus for different reasons. He was the kid who made everyone laugh, who could light up a room just by walking in, who remembered every single person's birthday and favorite ice cream flavor. His struggles with learning weren't hidden or shameful in our house. They were just part of who Marcus was, like his green eyes or his ability to quote entire episodes of The Office from memory. When he'd come home with another failed test, Mom would ruffle his hair and say intelligence came in all forms, and Marcus had the kind that mattered most, which was knowing how to make people feel loved. But something shifted the summer after his third attempt at graduating high school didn't work out. I was 16 that year, getting ready for my junior year, and Marcus was 21, still living at home, still trying to figure out what came next. The guidance counselor had gently suggested that maybe a traditional diploma wasn't in the cards, that there were other paths, vocational programs, life skills courses. I remember sitting on the stairs, listening to my parents discuss it with him in hushed voices in the living room below. Marcus's voice got louder and angrier, until finally he shouted that he wasn't stupid, he just learned differently. And why couldn't anyone see that? The sound of the front door slamming shook the whole house. After that night, Marcus developed this theory that intelligence, at least the kind measured by grades and tests and diplomas, was his enemy. Anyone who displayed that kind of intelligence was, by extension, attacking him personally. It started small, these little acts of rebellion against anything he saw as intellectual showing off. Our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, liked to do crossword puzzles on her front porch in the evenings. Marcus started making snide comments when he'd see her, asking if she was trying to prove something, if making other people feel dumb made her feel smart. Mrs. Chen, who'd known Marcus since he was in diapers, just looked sad and stopped doing her puzzles outside. Then there was the incident with our cousin Emma's chess set. Emma was 8 years old, this tiny little thing with pigtails who'd just joined her school's chess club. She brought her new set to Thanksgiving, so proud, wanting to teach everyone how to play. Marcus played one game with her, lost badly, and while everyone was clearing the table for pie, he took the chess set out to his truck. When Emma went looking for it later, crying because she couldn't find her special chess set that her other grandma had given her, Marcus just shrugged and said maybe she should keep better track of her things. I saw him toss something in the dumpster behind the grocery store the next day, but I was too scared to say anything. Our grandmother, Nana Rose, had always been Marcus's biggest defender. Even when everyone else got frustrated with him, she'd pat his cheek and tell him he was perfect just the way God made him. She lived with us for the last 5 years of her life, and she and Marcus had this whole routine. Every morning, she'd make him chocolate chip pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse, and every evening they'd watch Jeopardy together. Marcus would shout out wrong answers on purpose to make her laugh, and she'd pretend to scold him while sneaking him butterscotch candies. But Nana Rose also loved her brain training apps. She'd discovered them on the tablet I'd helped her set up, and she was obsessed with beating her high scores on the memory games. She'd sit at the kitchen table after dinner, glasses perched on her nose, finger jabbing at the screen with intense concentration. The night Marcus unplugged her tablet, right as she was about to beat her all-time high score on the pattern recognition game, was the night I started to see my brother differently. Nana Rose just stared at the black screen, then at Marcus, who was standing there with the cord in his hand. She asked him why he'd done that, her voice small and confused. Marcus's face was red, his jaw clenched, and he told her that those games were stupid, that they didn't mean anything, that she was wasting her time trying to prove she was smarter than everyone else. Nana Rose's eyes filled with tears, and she quietly said she just enjoyed the games. They kept her mind sharp, but if they bothered him, she'd stop playing them. She never touched the tablet again, and she died 2 months later. I've always wondered if giving up those games, that mental stimulation she loved, contributed to how quickly she declined at the end. After Nana Rose passed, Marcus got worse. It was like losing the one person who loved him unconditionally broke something inside him. He got a job at the King Soopers grocery store as a courtesy clerk, which he insisted on calling a front-end assistant because courtesy clerk sounded demeaning. His main job was helping people to their cars with groceries and collecting carts from the parking lot. He'd come home every day complaining about customers who used big words or asked him questions he couldn't answer. One woman asked him where to find quinoa, and he had to ask her to spell it, then still didn't know what it was. He came home that night and spent an hour ranting about pretentious people and their fancy health foods that were just designed to make normal people feel inferior. That's when I started learning Spanish, and not for any noble reason either. There was this girl, Sophia, who'd transferred to our school from California. She had this amazing smile and this way of laughing that made everyone around her want to laugh too. She was in my chemistry class, and we were lab partners. And every time she'd lean over to check our measurements, her hair would smell like vanilla and cinnamon. She'd moved from San Diego, where she'd grown up speaking both English and Spanish, floating between the two languages like it was the most natural thing in the world. Her family still spoke Spanish at home, and when she'd take phone calls from her mom in the hallway, I'd listen to the melody of her voice, not understanding a word but wishing I did. So I did what any 17-year-old with a massive crush would do. I downloaded Duolingo and started learning Spanish. I figured if I could learn enough to have a conversation, maybe impress her with a few phrases, it might give me an edge. It was stupid and optimistic and probably wouldn't have worked anyway, but it gave me something to focus on besides wondering if she noticed me the way I noticed her. I'd stay up late practicing pronunciation, whispering "Yo soy, tú eres," L's into the darkness of my room. I bought a Spanish-English dictionary at the used bookstore downtown and started carrying it in my backpack. I changed my phone settings to Spanish, which made everything take twice as long but forced me to learn. At first, I tried to keep it secret from Marcus. I knew how he'd react to me learning something new, especially something as obviously academic as a foreign language. I'd practice in my room with headphones on, watch Spanish YouTube videos on mute with subtitles, hide my workbooks under my mattress like contraband. But Marcus had developed this sixth sense for anything he perceived as intellectual showing off. He'd notice things like the way I'd pause before answering when Mom asked what I wanted for dinner, translating in my head, or how I'd accidentally let a gracias slip out instead of thanks. His eyes would narrow, and I'd see that familiar tension in his jaw. The confrontation came on a Tuesday evening in March. I was at the kitchen table doing homework, my Spanish workbook hidden under my calculus textbook. Marcus came in from work, still in his King Soopers vest, and went straight to the fridge for a Coke. As he passed behind me, he must have seen the edge of the Spanish book peeking out because he stopped cold. He reached over my shoulder and pulled it out, flipping through the pages where I'd carefully written verb conjugations and vocabulary lists. His face went through this series of expressions: disappointment, anger, and finally, betrayal. He asked me what this was, even though it was obviously a Spanish textbook. I told him I was learning Spanish for a class, lying instinctively. He said our school didn't require foreign languages, which was true. So I admitted it was for personal reasons. That's when he lost it. He slammed the book on the table so hard that Mom's coffee mug jumped and spilled old coffee across my calculus homework. He accused me of trying to make him feel stupid, of rubbing his face in the fact that I could learn things and he couldn't. I tried to explain about Sophia, about wanting to impress her, but he wasn't listening. He said learning Spanish was just another way for me to show off, to prove I was better than him. He grabbed the workbook and I grabbed it back, and we stood there in the kitchen playing tug of war with a $20 textbook, while Mom rushed in from the living room asking what was going on. Marcus won the tug of war and immediately went to the sink, turning on the water and holding the book under the stream. I watched my notes blur and run, weeks of work disappearing down the drain. Mom stood there frozen, not stopping him, not saying anything. When the book was thoroughly soaked, Marcus threw it in the trash and turned to Mom. He told her I was learning Spanish to make him feel bad about himself, that I was doing it on purpose because I knew languages were hard for him. Mom looked at me with this expression I'll never forget: disappointment mixed with exhaustion. She asked me if Spanish was really that important, if it was worth making my brother feel this way. That night at dinner, new rules were established. No Spanish in the common areas of the house. No practicing where Marcus could hear. No leaving Spanish materials where he might see them. If I wanted to pursue this, I had to do it in a way that didn't affect Marcus's mental health. Dad, who usually stayed out of these conflicts, backed Mom up. He said we all had to make sacrifices for family, and this seemed like a small thing to ask. I pointed out that Marcus wasn't making any sacrifices, but Dad just gave me that look that meant the discussion was over. So I adapted. I moved all my Spanish study materials to my room. I practiced with headphones on, volume turned low. I found a spot in the backyard behind the old garden shed where I could practice speaking out loud without being heard from the house. It was cold and uncomfortable, but it was better than nothing. Sophia and I had started texting, nothing serious, just memes and complaints about homework. But sometimes she'd send things in Spanish and I'd Google Translate them and try to respond correctly. Every successful exchange felt like a tiny victory. But Marcus's paranoia grew. He started what he called his wellness journal, but what was really a detailed log of every time he thought I was studying Spanish and how it affected him. He'd write things like Tuesday, 4:47 p.m., heard Spanish through the wall, immediate headache, had to take 3 Advil. Or Saturday, 2:15 p.m., saw a Spanish app notification on her phone, triggered anxiety attack, couldn't eat dinner. He'd show these entries to Mom like evidence in a court case, and she'd look at them seriously and then come talk to me about being more considerate. The restrictions got tighter. I couldn't study Spanish during what Marcus termed his recovery hours, which were basically whenever he was home and awake. So that left early mornings and late nights, times when normal teenagers should be sleeping. I started setting my alarm for 4:45 a.m., creeping downstairs in the dark to sit at the kitchen table with my phone brightness turned all the way down, practicing conjugations while the rest of the house slept. My grades started slipping in other subjects because I was so exhausted, but I was determined not to let Marcus win this battle. One morning, I fell asleep at the table over my phone and woke up to Marcus shaking my shoulder. The sun was just coming up, casting everything in this pale gray light. He looked at my phone screen, saw the Spanish lesson I'd been working on, and his face went dark. He said even knowing I was studying while he slept was affecting his sleep quality, giving him nightmares where everyone was speaking Spanish and he couldn't understand. He demanded I leave the house entirely if I wanted to keep studying. He suggested the 24/7 Starbucks downtown, said if Spanish mattered so much to me, I should be willing to make that sacrifice. That evening, my parents called a family meeting. We sat in the living room, Marcus in Dad's recliner like he was holding court, my parents on the couch, and me in the uncomfortable chair we usually piled laundry on. Mom explained that Marcus had been having trouble sleeping, that his work performance was suffering, and that they thought it best if I found somewhere else to study Spanish. Dad added that it was temporary, just until Marcus was in a better place mentally. I asked when that might be, and nobody had an answer. I wish I could say I handled it maturely, but I didn't. I stood up and told them they were being ridiculous, that they were enabling Marcus's controlling behavior, that this wasn't about his disability, but about his refusal to let anyone else grow or learn or be happy. I said things I'd been holding in for years about how they always chose Marcus's comfort over my needs, how they'd let him turn our home into a place where learning was literally forbidden. Marcus started crying, these big dramatic tears saying I was calling him stupid, that I hated him for how he was born. Mom rushed to comfort him while Dad told me I should be ashamed of myself. I laughed, actually laughed, which made everything worse. I told them about Emma's chess set, about Nana Rose's tablet, about all the times Marcus had destroyed things that brought other people joy just because they reminded him of his own struggles. Marcus's tears stopped abruptly, and he looked at me with such hatred that I took a step back. He said those were different, that those people were showing off, that they deserved what happened. That's when I realized my brother wasn't just struggling, he was cruel. I packed a bag that night, throwing in clothes and my Spanish materials and my laptop charger. Mom stood in my doorway asking where I thought I was going. I told her I was going to stay with my friend Jessica for a while, that I needed space from this toxic situation. She said I was being dramatic, that I was breaking the family apart over something as silly as a language. I looked her straight in the eye and told her the family was already broken. I was just the only one willing to admit it. Jessica's mom, Mrs. Martinez, didn't ask a lot of questions when I showed up at their door with my bags. She just hugged me and showed me to the guest room, said I could stay as long as I needed. Jessica told me later that her mom had been worried about me for a while, had noticed how tired I looked at school, how I'd stopped talking about home. The Martinezes spoke Spanish at home, had family dinners where 3 languages mixed together English, Spanish, and love. Being there was like stepping into the life I wanted but couldn't have. I kept going to school, kept up my grades, kept studying Spanish with new determination. Sophia and I grew closer, bonding over my terrible pronunciation and her patient corrections. She told me about her family's journey from Mexico to California to Colorado, about preserving culture through language, about how her grandmother only spoke Spanish and how Sophia translated the world for her. I told her about Marcus, about the bizarre situation at home, and she held my hand and said sometimes family meant knowing when to protect yourself from the people who were supposed to protect you. 2 weeks into my stay at Jessica's, I got a text from Dad saying Marcus had been fired from King Soopers. Apparently, he'd made what he called a joke to a Chinese customer, something about how at least he could speak the language of the country he lived in. The customer had complained, and given Marcus's previous warnings about his attitude, they'd let him go. Dad's text blamed me, said if I hadn't been studying Spanish and making Marcus feel insecure about languages, he never would have lashed out at that customer. I showed the text to Mrs. Martinez, and she said some people would rather blame the whole world than look in the mirror. Mom started calling daily, leaving voicemails that alternated between guilt trips and anger. She'd say things like, "I hope you're happy, your brother hasn't eaten in days," or, "When you have children of your own, you'll understand why we protect Marcus." I stopped listening to them after a while, just deleted them without playing them. But I couldn't delete the image of my family falling apart, even if I knew it had been broken long before I left. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Thursday, about 3 weeks after I'd left home. I was at the kitchen table with Jessica and Sophia working on a group project for history. My phone rang and it was Marcus. I almost didn't answer, but something made me swipe up. His voice was different, smaller somehow. He said he needed to talk to me. Really talk, not fight or blame or demand. He said please, which I couldn't remember him ever saying to me before. I met him at the park near our house the next day after school. He was sitting on the swing set we'd played on as kids, looking lost. When he saw me, he stood up but didn't come closer, like he was afraid I'd run if he moved too fast. He started talking, and it all came out in this rush about how he'd applied for a job at GameStop but couldn't fill out the application without help. How he'd been Googling what was wrong with him and found all these articles about learned helplessness and enabling families. How he'd realized that maybe the problem wasn't that everyone else was showing off, but that he'd given up trying. He told me about sitting in his room the night before, looking at all his video game posters and collectibles, thinking about how he knew everything about game development and industry trends, but had convinced himself that knowledge didn't count because it wasn't the kind that came with grades or diplomas. He said he'd thought about Nana Rose and her brain training games, how happy they'd made her, how he'd taken that away from her in her final months. His voice broke when he said he'd been so focused on what he couldn't do that he'd stopped everyone else from doing what they could. I sat down on the swing next to him and we swayed slightly in the spring breeze. I told him about Sophia's dad, how he owned a small gaming company that developed educational apps, how they were always looking for game testers who really understood player experience. I explained that I'd started learning Spanish partly to impress Sophia, yes, but also because her family only hired people they knew and trusted, and if I became part of their circle, Marcus could too. His face went through so many emotions that I couldn't track them all. He asked why I'd want to help him after everything he'd done. I told him he was still my brother, that I loved him even when I didn't like him, that everyone deserved a chance to change. He cried then, not the manipulative tears I'd seen so many times, but real, genuine sobs that shook his whole body. He told me he was scared, that he didn't know how to be different, that our parents had spent so long protecting him from failure that he didn't know how to try anymore. I put my arm around him and said we'd figure it out together. The conversation with our parents was harder. We went home together, and I'll never forget Mom's face when she saw us walk through the door side by side. She started crying immediately, saying her babies were home, but Marcus stopped her. He said there needed to be changes, real changes, not just me coming back to the same situation. He told them about the job possibility, about wanting to try therapy, about needing to learn how to be an adult instead of their eternal child. Dad looked skeptical, but Mom looked terrified, like the idea of Marcus not needing her was worse than him struggling forever. It took time. I moved back home, but with conditions. Spanish study was allowed anywhere, anytime. Marcus started seeing a therapist who specialized in learning disabilities and family dynamics. He joined an online support group for adults with similar challenges. Some days were better than others. He'd still get frustrated when he heard me practicing, but instead of lashing out, he'd put on headphones or go for a walk. He started asking me to teach him basic phrases, not because he was interested in Spanish, but because he wanted to understand why it mattered to me. The interview at Sophia's dad's company was a disaster and a triumph all at once. Marcus wore a suit that didn't quite fit right and brought a portfolio of handwritten notes about every bug he'd found in their games. His hands shook as he explained how his different way of thinking helped him spot patterns that others missed. How he approached games not as a critic, but as someone who genuinely wanted them to succeed, mister. Reyes asked him technical questions he couldn't answer, but then asked him to play their latest release and talk through his experience. Marcus lit up, pointing out a glitch in the third level that their entire QA team had missed, explaining exactly how to replicate it and why it was happening. He got the job. Not a high-level position, just entry-level game testing. But it was his. The first paycheck he earned, he bought me a set of Spanish language books and a card that said, "Thank you for not giving up on me when I gave up on myself." I keep that card in my wallet still, years later, a reminder of how far we've both come. The really beautiful thing was watching Marcus bloom in an environment where his differences were actually valued. His supervisor told me once that Marcus's inability to assume how things should work meant he caught issues that experienced testers missed because they were too familiar with gaming conventions. He moved up from basic testing to lead tester within a year, then to QA team supervisor. He moved out of our parents' house into a small apartment with 2 roommates from work who treated him like an equal, not a project. Mom struggled with the transition. She'd built her entire identity around being Marcus's protector, and watching him succeed without her was both wonderful and devastating. She started calling him multiple times a day, offering to do his laundry, bring him dinner, clean his apartment. Marcus had to set boundaries, tell her he loved her but needed to figure things out himself. She cried to me about feeling useless, and I suggested maybe she could volunteer with the Special Olympics or become an advocate for other families navigating learning disabilities. It took time, but she eventually found her way to a new role as Marcus's mother. Not his savior, Sophia and I dated through the rest of high school and into college. Her family embraced me like one of their own, and Sunday dinners at their house became my favorite tradition. Her grandmother, who spoke only Spanish, would pat my cheek and tell me my accent was terrible, but my heart was good, which felt like the highest compliment. Marcus would come sometimes, charming everyone with his encyclopedic knowledge of video games and his genuine interest in their stories. He learned enough Spanish to say please, thank you, and this food is delicious, which was really all he needed. The Marcus who stood outside my apartment that morning, 6 months after burning my textbook, was a different person than the brother who'd terrorized our family with his insecurities. He'd been living on his own for 3 months, paying his own bills, cooking his own meals badly, but doing it himself. He'd come to apologize again, even though he'd already done it 100 times, because his therapist said healing meant acknowledging harm even after forgiveness. He brought me a new Spanish textbook to replace the one he'd burned, and inside the front cover, he'd written, "This book belongs to my sister, who taught me that growing doesn't mean leaving others behind." We went for coffee that morning at the little place around the corner from my apartment. Marcus told me about his job, his apartment, the girl from accounting who'd asked him out, and how terrified he was to say yes because what if she found out he wasn't smart enough for her? I told him intelligence came in all forms, echoing what Mom used to say but meaning it differently. I said his intelligence was in seeing what others missed, in remembering every detail of things that mattered to him, in building connections through shared interests. He smiled and said maybe I was right. Maybe he'd say yes to that date after all. As we walked back to my apartment, Marcus asked if I was still studying Spanish. I told him I was minoring in it at college, that Sophia and I were planning to study abroad in Madrid next year. He asked if I thought he could ever learn another language, and I told him he already had. That he'd learned the language of trying, of growth, of being uncomfortable and doing it anyway. He laughed and said that was the kind of cheesy thing Sophia would say. And I laughed too because he was absolutely right. Looking back now, 5 years later, I can see how that horrible period shaped all of us. Marcus is a department head at a major gaming company, leading a team that includes several people with learning differences who he mentors with patience and understanding. He lives in a house he bought himself, has a serious girlfriend who adores his quirks, and calls our parents every Sunday, but no more than that. Mom volunteers as an advocate for families with special needs children, teaching them the difference between protection and enabling. Dad took early retirement and started building custom furniture, finding peace in working with his hands. And me, I'm a translator for a nonprofit that helps immigrant families navigate healthcare systems. I spend my days switching between English and Spanish, using the language that once tore my family apart to help bring other families together. Sophia and I didn't make it past college, but we're still friends, and she still teases me about my accent. Sometimes Marcus joins me for volunteer events, using his unique perspective to help design more accessible materials for people with learning disabilities. The path from that night when he burned my textbook to where we are now wasn't straight or smooth. There were setbacks and arguments and moments when I thought we'd never repair what was broken. But families are strange organisms, capable of both tremendous harm and tremendous healing. We learned that love doesn't mean accepting someone's worst behavior, that boundaries aren't cruel but necessary, that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their self-destruction. Marcus kept that wellness journal he used to track his complaints about my Spanish studying, but now he uses it differently, writing down moments of growth and challenge and triumph. He showed me an entry from last week that said, "Help new team member with dyslexia set up assistive technology. Remembered when I couldn't even admit I needed help. Grateful for the journey." Below that, in his still messy handwriting, he'd added, "Thank you, Hermana," which is Spanish for sister, spelled correctly and everything. The shed in our parents' backyard where I used to hide to practice Spanish is now Mom's potting shed, full of gardening tools and seed packets. But sometimes when I visit, I go stand behind it and remember that shivering girl conjugating verbs in the cold, determined to learn something new despite every obstacle. I think about how that small act of rebellion, that insistence on growth, ended up saving not just me, but my whole family. How Marcus's attempts to control and limit others was really about his own fear of being left behind, and how addressing that fear head-on was the only way forward. These days, when people ask about my family, I tell them we're close but complicated, loving but learning. I tell them about my brother who turned his biggest weakness into his greatest strength, about parents who had to learn that love means letting go, about how sometimes the most painful conflicts lead to the most necessary changes. I tell them in English and Spanish, switching between languages like Sophia taught me, each word a small victory over the silence that once threatened to suffocate us all. Last month, Marcus sent me a photo from his company's holiday party. He was standing with his team, wearing a shirt that said Director of Quality Assurance in multiple languages, including Spanish. His girlfriend had helped him design it as a joke, but I knew it was more than that. It was an acknowledgement of where we'd been and how far we'd come, of the languages we'd learned beyond words, patience, forgiveness, growth, and the hardest language of all, change. In the photo, he's smiling that genuine smile I remember from when we were kids, before the world told him he wasn't enough, before he believed it, before we all proved that message wrong together. The story could end there, with that photo and its proof of transformation. But real life doesn't wrap up neatly like that. Last week, Marcus called me in a panic because his girlfriend had suggested he take a cooking class and he'd spiraled into old fears about being judged for not knowing things. We talked for an hour about how growth isn't linear, how old wounds can reopen when we least expect it, how the work of becoming ourselves is never really finished. He signed up for the class the next day, texting me pictures of his lopsided attempts at pasta with the caption, "At least I'm trying, right?" "Right," I texted back. In Spanish and English both, because some messages are too important for just one language. And that's the truth we learned the hard way, that trying is everything, that the attempt matters more than the outcome, that the willingness to be bad at something new is the highest form of courage. Marcus taught me that eventually, though he had to learn it first himself. And maybe that's what family is really for, not to protect us from growth, but to witness our becoming, messy and painful and beautiful as it always is. When I think about that morning 6 months ago, Marcus crying outside my apartment, I realize he wasn't just apologizing for burning my textbook or the months of control and cruelty that preceded it. He was mourning the person he'd been and celebrating the person he was becoming, standing in that liminal space between who we were and who we're meant to be. That's where all the best stories live, in that space of transformation where Spanish textbooks become bridges, and video games become careers, and broken families become whole in new and unexpected ways. And if there's a lesson in all of this, it's that we're all learning languages all the time. The language of our own worth. The language of healthy boundaries, the language of trying and failing and trying again. Some of us learn faster than others, some need different methods or more support or extra time. But we're all capable of fluency in the things that matter most. Connection, growth, forgiveness, love. Even when the textbooks get burned, even when the words come out wrong, even when we have to start over from absolute silence, we keep learning. Because that's what humans do, what families do, what love does. It teaches us new languages, one careful word at a time. I still have that card Marcus gave me with his first paycheck, the one thanking me for not giving up on him. But I've realized over the years that he's the one who never truly gave up. Even in his darkest moments of control and fear, some part of him must have known there was another way to be. He just needed someone to believe it was possible, to hold up a mirror that showed not his limitations, but his potential. We all need that sometimes. Someone to see us not as we are, but as we could be, and to love us through the distance between those two selves. So when people ask me why I became a translator, I tell them it's because I learned young that language is never just about words. It's about building bridges between worlds, about making the foreign familiar and the familiar new again. It's about believing that understanding is possible even when people are speaking entirely different languages, literally or metaphorically. Every day in my work, I think about Marcus and me, how we had to learn to translate our pain into words the other could hear, how we had to become bilingual in each other's experiences to find our way back to being family. The Denver suburb where we grew up looks the same but feels different when I visit now. The park where Marcus and I had our breakthrough conversation has new playground equipment, but the swings remain, creaking in the wind like old friends. The King Soopers where Marcus used to work has been remodeled, but I still think of him every time I pass it. Remember the boy who was so afraid of being seen as less than that he tried to make everyone else smaller too? That boy is gone now, replaced by a man who leads with empathy, who turns his struggles into strengths, who proves every day that there are infinite ways to be intelligent and valuable and whole. Sometimes, on quiet Sunday mornings, Marcus and I meet for breakfast at the diner that used to be the 24/7 Starbucks where he wanted to exile me. We order too much food and catch up on our weeks, slipping occasionally into the Spanish phrases I've taught him, or the gaming terminology he's taught me. We laugh about things that once made us cry, share fears that once would have started wars. We're siblings who had to learn how to like each other, who discovered that love isn't always enough, but it's a good place to start. And when the check comes, we still fight over who pays, some dynamics too fundamental to change. But it's a playful fight now, the kind that ends with laughter instead of tears, the kind that says, we're still here, still trying, still becoming the people we're meant to be. One word, one day, one language at a time. The impact of our journey extends far beyond just Marcus and me. Last year, I was invited to speak at a conference for families navigating learning disabilities, and I brought Marcus with me. We stood together on that stage, two siblings who'd fought our way from destruction to understanding, and told our story to a room full of parents and children who saw themselves in our struggles. There was a moment when Marcus talked about the night he burned my Spanish textbook, where you could hear the collective intake of breath from the audience, everyone recognizing that moment of rock bottom in their own lives. After our presentation, a mother came up to us with tears streaming down her face. She had two daughters, one with severe dyslexia, one without, and they were constantly at war. The daughter without learning challenges had started hiding her report cards, pretending to fail tests, dimming her own light because her sister's jealousy had become so intense. The mother didn't know what to do, how to protect both children without sacrificing either. Marcus spent an hour with that family, sharing not just what he'd done wrong, but the slow, painful work of making it right. He gave the girl with dyslexia his business card and told her to email him anytime she felt that rage building up, that urge to tear others down because the world felt so impossibly stacked against her. That girl emails him still, 2 years later. Sometimes it's angry rants about unfair teachers or classmates who don't understand. Sometimes it's victories, like when she finally finished reading her first full novel or when she got accepted into art school. Marcus prints out every email and keeps them in a folder labeled Proof of Change. He showed me one recently where she wrote, "My sister got into Harvard and I'm genuinely happy for her. I never thought I'd be able to write that sentence and mean it." Below it, Marcus had written back, "I know exactly how hard that was to write. I'm proud of you." Our story has become something bigger than just a family reconciliation. Mom started a support group for parents that meets in our old church basement every Tuesday night. She calls it Loving Without Limiting, and it's for families struggling to balance supporting a child with disabilities while not sacrificing their other children or enabling destructive behaviors. The first night, only 3 people showed up. Now they have to set up extra chairs, and Mom has trained facilitators to start groups in other neighborhoods. She tells every new parent the same thing she wishes someone had told her 20 years ago, that protecting your child from failure isn't love. It's fear dressed up in love's clothing. Dad found his voice too, in his own quiet way. He started writing letters to Marcus and me, these long handwritten things that would arrive in our mailboxes on random Tuesdays. In them, he'd share his own struggles with feeling inadequate, how his father had made him feel stupid for preferring woodworking to academics, how he'd sworn he'd never make his children feel that way, and then watched helplessly as it happened anyway. One letter to Marcus said, "I failed you by trying to protect you from a world I was convinced would hurt you. I should have prepared you to face it with strength instead." Marcus has that letter framed in his office, a reminder that even parents are just people trying their best with the tools they have. The ripple effects continue. Marcus's gaming company started a neurodiversity initiative after seeing how his unique perspective improved their products. They now actively recruit testers with various learning differences. understanding that different brains catch different problems. Marcus leads the program, conducting interviews where he asks questions like, "Tell me about a time you solved a problem in a way that surprised other people," instead of, "What's your educational background?" He's hired people with dyslexia, ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, and other learning differences, building a team that approaches problems from angles neurotypical testers might never consider. One of his hires, a young man named David who has dyscalculia, found a mathematical error in their code that had been causing microtransactions to round incorrectly. The company had been losing thousands of dollars monthly to this tiny glitch that traditional QA had missed because the math looked right at first glance. But David's brain processed numbers differently, saw patterns where others saw normal operations, and saved the company more money in 6 months than his salary cost for 3 years. Marcus loves telling that story, proof that different doesn't mean less than, just different. I think often about Nana Rose and wonder what she would make of who we've become. Sometimes I visit her grave and tell her about Marcus's success, about the family we've rebuilt from the ashes of the one that fell apart. I leave butterscotch candies on her headstone, the ones she used to sneak to Marcus, and tell her about the brain training apps he now recommends to his team, how he encourages them to keep their minds sharp and curious. I tell her I'm sorry for not standing up for her that night with the tablet, for being too scared of disrupting family peace to protect her joy. But I also tell her that her death wasn't in vain, that losing her was part of what finally broke through Marcus's walls. The concept of intelligence has been completely redefined in our family. We used to see it as this narrow thing measured by tests and grades and diplomas. Now we understand it as a constellation of abilities, each bright in its own way. Marcus's intelligence lives in his ability to see what others miss, to approach problems without preconceived notions, to connect with people who feel unseen by traditional systems. Mine lives in language and translation, in building bridges between worlds. Mom's lives in her emotional intuition, her ability to hold space for complex feelings. Dad's lives in his hands, in the beautiful furniture he creates that will outlast all of us. Even our definition of family has expanded. The Martinez family who took me in during those crucial weeks are still part of our chosen family. We spend holidays together, mixing traditions and languages and foods in a beautiful chaos of belonging. Jessica's younger brother is starting high school now and struggling with ADHD, and Marcus has become his informal mentor, showing him apps that help with organization and time management, sharing his own strategies for navigating a world that wasn't built for brains like theirs. The boy idolizes Marcus, the successful adult who understands what it's like to think differently. And Marcus takes that responsibility seriously. Sophia and I may not have ended up together romantically, but she changed my life in ways that go far beyond a teenage crush. She invited me into a world where multilingualism was celebrated, where code switching between languages and cultures was a superpower, not a betrayal. Her grandmother, who passed away last year, left me a note in her will, written in Spanish, that thanked me for learning her language even though my pronunciation was terrible. She wrote that language is love made audible, and that my willingness to sound foolish in Spanish showed more respect than perfect grammar ever could. I carry that note in my wallet next to Marcus's card, 2 pieces of paper that remind me why I do what I do. The work I do now at the nonprofit feels like coming full circle. Every day I meet families torn between languages and cultures, children who translate for their parents at doctor's appointments, parents who fear their children are losing their heritage language. I see echoes of my own family's struggles in theirs, the way language can divide or unite, the way learning something new can feel like betrayal to those left behind. I share our story when appropriate, how my brother saw my Spanish studies as abandonment, how we had to learn that growth isn't a zero-sum game, that one person's advancement doesn't diminish another's worth. Last month, I worked with a family from Guatemala where the teenage son was refusing to speak Spanish at home, ashamed of his parents' accents, wanting desperately to be just American. His younger sister was caught in the middle, wanting to preserve their family's language but not wanting to betray her brother. The parents were heartbroken, seeing their culture slip away with each English-only conversation. I brought Marcus to meet with them, and he talked about being on the other side of that divide, about feeling left behind by language, about the fear that turns to anger that turns to destruction. By the end of the meeting, the teenager was crying, admitting he was scared his Spanish marked him as different, as less than. Marcus told him different was just different, not less than, and that running from your difference only makes it chase you harder. The therapeutic value of sharing our story continues to surprise me. Marcus's therapist, Dr. Chen, once told us that healing happens not just in the therapy room, but in the brave act of vulnerability with others. Every time we tell our story, we choose again to face what happened, to own our parts in it, to celebrate how far we've come. It's not always easy. Sometimes Marcus still flinches when he talks about burning my textbook. Sometimes I still feel that old anger rise when I remember crying over the ashes. But we've learned that feelings are information, not instructions, that we can acknowledge pain without letting it drive our actions. Marcus's girlfriend, Anna, has become an integral part of our family's continued healing. She's a special education teacher who met Marcus at a gaming convention where he was speaking about neurodiversity in tech. She says she fell in love with his honesty about his struggles, his commitment to growth, his ability to laugh at himself without diminishing himself. She's taught him strategies for managing frustration that his therapist hadn't covered. Simple things like naming 5 things he can see when he feels that old rage building. She's also fiercely protective of his growth, calling out our parents when they slip into old patterns of babying him, reminding them that Marcus is a capable adult who happens to have learning differences. The first time Anna came to family dinner, there was this moment of tension when Mom started cutting Marcus's meat for him, an old habit from when he struggled with fine motor skills. Anna gently put her hand on Mom's and said, "He's got it." Mom looked startled, then ashamed, then grateful, all in the span of seconds. Later, Mom thanked Anna for seeing what she'd been too close to see, for protecting Marcus from her protection. It's become a family joke now. "He's got it," our shorthand for remembering to let each other struggle and succeed on our own terms. The intersection of language and disability continues to fascinate me professionally. I've started researching how multilingualism affects people with different learning disabilities, finding that some people with dyslexia actually find certain languages easier to read than English because of more consistent spelling rules. I'm working on a paper with Marcus about how gaming languages, the complex vocabularies of different game genres and platforms, represent a form of fluency that's often dismissed as trivial. He's helping me understand how mastery feels different when it's self-directed, when it's driven by passion rather than curriculum. We're planning to present it at next year's conference, 2 siblings bridging the gap between academic research and lived experience. Our neighborhood has watched this transformation with the mixture of gossip and genuine care that characterizes suburban communities. Miss Chen started doing her crossword puzzles on her porch again, and Marcus makes a point of asking her about them when he visits, genuinely curious about the clever wordplay he once saw as an attack. The family whose daughter's chess set he threw away has cautiously rebuilt their relationship with us. Emma, now a teenager and a ranked chess player, actually taught Marcus the game properly last Christmas. He's terrible at it, but enjoys it anyway. And she's patient with him in a way that makes my heart ache with pride for how far we've all come. The financial impact of that period is something we rarely discuss but can't ignore. My parents spent thousands on Marcus's therapy, on family counseling, on programs to help him build independent living skills. They refinanced the house to pay for it all, choosing his healing over their retirement security. When Marcus found out, he was devastated, wanted to pay them back immediately. But Dad told him the only repayment they wanted was for him to live a full life, to use what he'd learned to help others. So that's what he does, living generously with his time and experience, paying forward what can never truly be paid back. I sometimes wonder about the alternative timeline, the one where I gave up Spanish that first time Marcus complained, where I let his fears shape my choices, where our family continued in that toxic stability that looked like peace but was really just slow suffocation. Would Marcus have ever found his strength? Would I have found mine? Would our parents have learned the difference between protection and love? There's no way to know, but I'm grateful every day for that stubborn 17-year-old who refused to stop learning, who pushed back against a system designed to keep everyone small and safe and miserable. The language metaphors in our story feel almost too perfect sometimes. The way Marcus literally burned my words, trying to destroy the bridge I was building to another world. The way silence became our family's first language. How we had to learn to speak truth like foreigners stumbling over unfamiliar sounds. The way translation became my profession, turning incomprehension into understanding every single day. But maybe that's how healing works, in symbols and metaphors that help us make sense of senseless pain, that give shape to the shapeless work of becoming whole. Marcus recently started dating someone new after he and his first girlfriend amicably parted ways. Her name is Elena, and she's deaf. Watching Marcus learn ASL with the same intensity he once brought to destroying languages has been profound. He practices constantly, his hands moving through the air with increasing fluency, building bridges he once would have burned. He told me that signing requires a different kind of intelligence, a spatial and physical awareness that his brain actually processes well. He's already planning to add ASL fluency to his team's communication options, understanding that accessibility means meeting people where they are in whatever language they speak. The irony isn't lost on me that Marcus, who once saw all language learning as a personal attack, is now trilingual in English, gaming terminology, and ASL, with basic Spanish phrases thrown in. He jokes that he's collecting languages like Pokemon, gotta catch 'em all. But I see the deeper truth that every new word he learns is a victory over the part of himself that wanted to keep the world small and manageable. Every sign he masters is proof that growth is always possible, that our brains are more capable than we imagine, that intelligence takes infinite forms if we're brave enough to look for them. Our family's story has become teaching material in several family therapy programs, a case study in enabling enmeshment and eventual healthy differentiation. Chen wrote a paper about us, with our permission and names changed, titled, When Protection Becomes Prison, A Family's Journey from Enabling to Empowering. Marcus and I read it together. Strange to see our pain transformed into professional language, our chaos organized into therapeutic concepts. But if it helps one family recognize their own patterns earlier, helps one sibling stand up for their right to grow, helps one parent see the difference between love and limitation, then the exposure feels worth it. The most profound change might be in how we handle conflict now. We still disagree, still hurt each other's feelings sometimes, still carry the echoes of old wounds. But we've learned to fight fair, to separate the person from the problem, to repair quickly when we cause harm. Last month, Marcus accidentally deleted a presentation I'd worked on for days, and I felt that old fury rise up. But instead of attacking him, I took a breath and said, I'm really upset about losing that work, and I need some space to feel that without saying something hurtful. He apologized genuinely, helped me recover what we could, and made notes about backup systems to prevent future losses. It was conflict without cruelty, frustration without devastation. The Denver skyline looks different from when we were children, new buildings reaching toward the mountains, the city growing and changing like we have. Sometimes Marcus and I drive through our old neighborhood, past the house where so much pain and healing happened, past the park with the swings, past the King Soopers where he learned he was worth more than opening doors. We don't talk much on these drives, just witness together the geography of our transformation. The places remain, but we're different people moving through them, carrying our history but not controlled by it. As I write this, it's another Sunday morning, and I'm waiting for Marcus at our usual diner. He's late, texting that Elena is teaching him a new sign for sorry that conveys more nuance than the basic one he knows. I smile at my phone, at this brother who once couldn't say sorry at all, now learning multiple ways to express regret in a language that didn't exist for him 2 years ago. The waitress refills my coffee and asks if I'm waiting for someone. Yes, I tell her. My brother. She doesn't know she's witnessing a miracle, that those 2 words, my brother, contain a universe of pain and healing and hope. When he arrives, he signs sorry before speaking it, his hands moving through air with careful precision. I sign back, it's okay, one of the few phrases he's taught me so far. We order our usual too much food and catch up on our weeks. He tells me about a new hire who reminds him of himself 5 years ago. Brilliant at finding bugs, but convinced his inability to code makes him worthless. I tell him about a family from Somalia I'm working with, how the grandmother only speaks Somali and watches her grandchildren lose their heritage one English word at a time. We talk about language and loss and the space between who we were and who we're becoming. The check comes and we do our usual dance of who pays, but this time a family at the next table is watching us with recognition. The mother approaches hesitantly and asks if we're the siblings from the Learning Disabilities Conference. We confirm we are, and she starts crying, telling us her son has autism and her daughter is gifted and they can't stop hurting each other. We invite them to sit, and suddenly our breakfast becomes an impromptu support group. Marcus sharing his journey with the boy while I talk to the girl about protecting her own growth while loving someone who experiences the world differently. This is our life now. Our story rippling outward in ways we never imagined when we were trapped in that house of silence and suppression. We've become accidental advocates, reluctant experts in the delicate dance of differential abilities within families. It's not what either of us planned, but it feels right. Like all that pain was composting into something useful. Something that could nourish other families struggling through similar soil. The thing about languages is they're living entities, always evolving, borrowing from each other, creating new words for new realities. Our family had to invent its own language for healing, had to find words for experiences that English couldn't quite capture. We borrowed from therapy speak and pop psychology, from Marcus's gaming terminology and my Spanish studies, from Dad's woodworking metaphors and Mom's garden analogies. We created a pidgin of recovery, a Creole of compassion, a dialect of doing better, and we're still learning, still adding new vocabulary as we encounter new challenges. Marcus learning ASL has opened conversations about different types of communication barriers, about how deafness and learning disabilities intersect and diverge. My work with immigrant families has taught me about linguistic trauma, how losing your mother tongue can feel like losing your mother, how English-only policies echo through generations. Mom's Support Group has developed its own shorthand for complex family dynamics, turning clinical terms into accessible tools for overwhelmed parents. The story never really ends, just transforms. That girl who emails Marcus is in college now, studying to become an art therapist for children with learning disabilities. The families we've met through sharing our story have formed their own support networks, their own chosen families of people who understand. The ripples continue outward, touching lives we'll never know about, changing futures in ways we can't track or measure. Sometimes I dream about parallel universes where things went differently. One where Marcus never developed his hatred of learning, where we grew up as supportive siblings from the start. One where I gave up Spanish and every other dream to keep him comfortable. One where our family imploded completely, where the wounds were too deep to heal. But I always wake up grateful for this universe, messy and painful and real, where we did the hard work of becoming better people, where love meant learning to let go, where burning a textbook led to building a life. The morning I started writing this story feels like a lifetime ago, though it was only hours. The coffee's cold now, the diner filling up with the lunch crowd. Marcus left for a meeting with his team, but not before programming a reminder in my phone to back up my work. His way of taking care of me now. I sit here surrounded by the gentle chaos of strangers living their own complex stories. And I think about how every family is translating constantly, trying to understand each other across the divide of individual experience, building dictionaries of shared meaning, one difficult conversation at a time. If someone asked me now what I learned from those dark months when my brother tried to control my learning, I'd say this: we're all afraid of being left behind. Every single one of us carries that fear that others will grow beyond us, move past us, stop needing us. The healthy response is to grow too, to celebrate others' expansion as inspiration for our own. The unhealthy response is to try to keep everyone small enough to need us, controlled enough to stay close. Our family chose the unhealthy response for years, mistaking smallness for safety, limitation for love. It nearly destroyed us. But here's the beautiful thing about humans: we can change. Not easily, not without cost, but genuinely and profoundly change. The brother who burned my Spanish textbook now signs fluently with his deaf girlfriend. The parents who enabled destruction now empower growth. The girl who hid in the shed to study now helps families bridge linguistic divides. We're living proof that the story you're in the middle of isn't the story you have to end with, that families can rewrite their definitions of love, that it's never too late to learn a new language, literal or metaphorical. So that's our story, mine and Marcus's and our families. A story about language and limitation and the long journey from one to the other. A story about how burning bridges sometimes lights the way to building better ones. A story about siblings who had to learn to see each other as whole humans instead of supporting characters in each other's dramas. A story about parents who had to grieve the children they thought they were protecting to meet the adults their children were becoming. A story about how intelligence isn't one thing but thousands. How every brain has its own brilliance if we create space for it to shine. Most of all, it's a story about translation in the deepest sense. How we all speak different languages of fear and hope and hurt and healing. How the work of family is learning to hear what others are really saying beneath their words. Marcus was never really angry about Spanish or chess or brain training games. He was terrified of being left behind, of confirming his worst fears about himself, of being alone in a world that measured worth by metrics he couldn't meet. Once we learned to translate his anger as fear, his control as plea, his destruction as desperate attempt at connection, everything changed. And maybe that's the final lesson. That behavior is a language too, that the things we do when we're hurting are sentences in a grammar of pain. Learning to read that language with compassion instead of judgment, to respond to the need beneath the action, to translate destruction into opportunity for construction. That's the work of love. It's hard work, heartbreaking work, sometimes seemingly impossible work. But it's the work that makes us human, that turns families from prisons into sanctuaries, that transforms burned textbooks into bridges toward a bigger, brighter world where there's room for everyone to grow. The afternoon sun slants through the diner windows, illuminating dust motes that dance like words in the air between tables. Somewhere, Marcus is leading his team through a new game, catching bugs others miss. Somewhere, our parents are tending their garden, growing things they used to be afraid to plant. Somewhere, families are struggling with the same dynamics that nearly broke us. But maybe, hopefully, our story will reach them like a message in a bottle, telling them that shore exists, that the journey is possible, that translation is always possible between hearts willing to learn each other's languages. I close my laptop, leave money for the check, and step out into the Denver afternoon. The mountains stand steady on the horizon, unchanging anchors in a world of transformation. I think of that scared girl studying Spanish behind a shed, that angry boy burning books he couldn't read, those parents paralyzed between love and enabling. We're all still here, all still learning, all still becoming. The textbook burned, but the language survived. The family broke, but rebuilt stronger. The limitations we thought were love revealed themselves as fear, and in naming them truly, we found our way to something better, something real, something worth 10,000 words and more. A story that continues with every word we speak, every bridge we build, every language we learn in the lifelong curriculum of being human together.